Fascinating news story out of New Yorker, Jane Mayer, one of the best journalists we have in the country, breaking a story about a second Steele memo. Now, if you don't remember, Steele's the guy who wrote the first dossier about Trump and what he might have done with the Russians. That had one sensational story about golden showers in a hotel room. Apparently, in this new Jane Mayer piece, we find out that one of the guys who wrote it didn't even want to include that because, true or not true, he was worried he would over-sensationalize it when the more pedestrian parts of the memo were far more important about Trump aides and Trump's campaign's connections to the Russians. Now, if you read that memo, at least 4 parts of it have already been proven to be correct and are now beyond dispute, including very important things like Carter Page, a Trump campaign official meeting with Russians in Moscow. Now, it turns out there was a second memo written, and that's already huge news right there. And wait till you get a load of what's in it. Turns out the Russians, if you believe these allegations, helped to pick our Secretary of State. Now, there's very good reasons to believe it, but let me give you the full context. Mayer explains, one subject that Steele is believed to have discussed with Mueller's investigators is a memo that he wrote in late November 2016 after his contract with Fusion had ended. That's the people that he wrote the original dossier for. This memo, which did not surface publicly with the others, is shorter than the rest and is based on one source described as, quote, a senior Russian official. Okay, now, if you're a Robert Mueller, you want to find out who that senior Russian official is, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes here in the US, who they were talking to on the other side. So we'll get to that in a second. The official said that he was merely relaying talk circulating in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but what he'd heard was astonishing. People were saying that the Kremlin had intervened to block Trump's initial choice of Secretary of State, Mitt Romney. Well, if that is true, that is indeed astonishing. Now, it might not be astonishing to you guys if you watch the Young Turks, because I told you from the get-go that Rex Tillerson was clearly chosen because the Russians wanted him to lift the sanctions. I said that from the day that, not that he was announced, probably before he was announced, when he was being considered. I said, why in the world would you have the former CEO of Exxon be the Secretary of State? That makes no sense, except for the $500 billion deal that Russia had with Exxon, and that's what the sanctions blocked. So we'll get back to Rex Tillerson in a second, but let's continue about Romney. The memo said that the Kremlin, through unspecified channels, had asked Trump to appoint someone who would be prepared to lift Ukraine-related sanctions and who would cooperate on security issues of interest to Russia, such as the conflict in Syria. Now, if Trump actually did this, look, I don't care about the word treason and whether that crime can be pursued or not. But obviously, he would be gone. To let another country, any country, pick our Secretary of State so that the sanctions could be lifted on that country. Do I have to bother explaining why that would be horrific and not acceptable for the President of the United States to do? So, okay. If Mueller proves this, game over, completely over. President Trump is obviously out. I imagine he would resign before he was impeached, but prison would also be something that would be seriously considered. I don't know if it would go to that just because of how deeply embarrassed the whole country would be, given that our president is working apparently at the behest of another country. Now you can say, hey, it hasn't been proven yet, and it hasn't been proven in a court of law, but this guy's been right over and over. In the beginning, when I saw the Steele memo, I was very skeptical about the whole thing. You could watch old clips of me being skeptical about it. But after it was proven right 4 different times, and now we're on to this, and it matches the logic of what we have seen in public, and he's got a source, well, that's a lot of ands. We'll see what Mueller comes up with, which is the most important part. But let's keep going here. In any case, on December 13, 2016, Mayer reports, Trump gave Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, the job. The choice was a surprise to most and a happy one in Moscow because Tillerson's business ties with the Kremlin were long-standing and warm. I detailed for you guys those ties about a year ago when Tillerson was first picked. He's very good friends with both Putin. He's gotten an award from the Russian government. Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, has. Why? Because they were making business deals regarding oil. So as a businessman, I guess that makes sense. As our Secretary of State, less sense. Anyway, he also has very good ties with the major oil companies in Russia. And one of the guys who had the sanctions put on him, one of the Russian oligarchs, said that he was looking forward to come back to America so he could ride motorcycles with Rex Tillerson. So in 2011, by the way, he also, Tillerson did, brokered a historic partnership between ExxonMobil and Rosneft. That's the one that I've been telling you about for a year now. That's the one that was blocked by the sanctions, and both ExxonMobil and Russia was heavily motivated to lift and then have that deal go through. Now, here's another interesting part of the Mayor piece in the New Yorker. The White House declined to comment about any communications that Trump team may have had with Russia on the subject. Really? You couldn't get a denial on that issue? So a reporter calls the White House and says, we have a memo saying that you let another country pick our Secretary of State. And they go, well, we declined to comment on that particular issue. What? No, if you didn't do it, a massive denial is in order. Are you insane that we let some other country pick our Secretary of State? Of course we didn't. Would be the correct response to that. No comment? Decline to comment about any communications that the Trump team may have had with Russia on the subject. I know that Mueller's on their trail, and so they're now worried about lying to the authorities, etc. But that appears to be very telling. All right, that's interesting. Now, one more for Mayor. After the election, Congress imposed additional sanctions on Russia in retaliation for its interference. But Trump and Tillerson have resisted enacting them. So there's the one thing about how it looks like, based on this information from a source within the Russian government, they say, no, not Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was very harsh on Russia when he ran against Obama in 2012, so they don't want him under any circumstance. But yes, Rex Tillerson, he's a good friend of ours, and we have I say $500 billion deal, but the revenue from that deal would actually was estimated to be $9 trillion, not billion, trillion. That's a lot of reasons to collaborate with someone. Instead, we'll take Rex Tillerson. They don't deny it. And since then, but do you have evidence that Tillerson has helped the Russians and Trump has helped the Russians? Well, both of them say we will not put the sanctions in place. Even though Trump signed it into law, we're just not gonna do it. We're not gonna do it now, we didn't do it before, we're not gonna do it later, we're just not gonna do it. In fact, a separate story unrelated to this also broke today. The State Department has spent $0 of the $120 million allocated by Congress to combat foreign efforts to influence US elections. Who's the State Department run by? Oh, right, Rex Tillerson. Well, what a happy coincidence again for Russia that the Secretary of State that they might have picked themselves has decided that he's not going to combat Russian interference in our elections. And despite the massive budget, HuffPost reports, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has done little to thwart a sweeping influence campaign by the Russian government, and an office tasked with countering such efforts has no employees that even speak Russian. They're not even pretending. It's comical. Tillerson himself has continued to doubt the ability of his department to combat Russia, and just last month said that if Moscow wanted to meddle, it was, quote, going to find ways to do that. Well, that's really encouraging. Here's our Secretary of State going, what do you want me to do about it? If they're gonna meddle, they're gonna meddle. Well, we gave you $120 million to do something about it. He's not going to, though. Which begs the question, who does he work for? So that also goes to the president. Now, speaking of which, let's go to Dan Coates. He works for the president. He's appointed by Donald Trump, huge right-winger, massive conservative. Now, Director of National Intelligence. So what does he have to say about whether there's Russian interference? Well, under Trump, you'd imagine he'd say, that's a hoax, or nope. Here is Trump's own Director of National Intelligence saying, quote, we expect Russia to continue using propaganda, social media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokespeople, and other means to influence to try to exacerbate social and political fissures in the United States. There should be no doubt that Russia perceives its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 US midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations. Hey, Russia, you should have also told Trump who to pick as his director of national intelligence. Because Dan Coates, although he's deeply conservative there and picked by Donald Trump, is being principled and saying, yes, of course they interfered and they're looking to do it again. I don't know if this is basically beseeching Tillerson and other parts of the government. For God's sake, will you do something already? And by do something, we don't mean war. Certainly I don't mean further hostilities. I mean, can you take precautions to make sure that the voting booths are protected? Can you do standard things to make sure that our elections have integrity and that we can count on them and that it is in fact our democracy? But if a foreign government is picking our cabinet officials, that is not what I would call a healthy democracy. That is what I would call deeply illegal and something that needs to be addressed immediately. So we'll all find out soon enough, I hope, when Mueller concludes his investigation. And by the way, if he looks into all of this and decides, no, that memo was wrong, he'll let us know. And if he thinks it's right, he better have a lot of evidence if he's going to try to go after the president of the United States. And he's a very careful prosecutor. So if he does in fact say this happened, my guess is that he will have overwhelming evidence. And by the way, just because the case hasn't happened, there is no indictment of Trump yet, doesn't mean that evidence does not exist. There is a lot of evidence already in public. They will not enforce the sanctions. They will not try to combat Russia's meddling in our elections. They refuse to spend the money. They refuse to take any actions. And Tillerson, we know for a fact, was a very good ally of the Russian government and wanted those sanctions lifted. He was on the record on that. And he was picked when the CEO of an oil company makes no sense at all as Secretary of State with no foreign policy experience. It's right in front of your eyes if you care to see it. If you become a member of the Young Turks, you'll be saying,
I'm like a smart person.
So do it right now, tytnetwork.com/join. Get the whole Young Turks show every day.